Today's daf is daf Zion, and we'll begin where we left off yesterday on daf Vav Hamid Beis, the last two lines. Hilchasa Kirab Yeshua ben Karcha v'Hilchasa Kirab Yehuda. So there's a statement here of Rav Huna that's going to get Rav Yosef a little bit angry, and Rav Huna paskins on two counts. One, he paskins like Rav Yeshua ben Karcha, and that's the issue that we discussed about a differentiation between milva b'shtar and milva belpeh as far as collecting a loan, an outstanding loan from an akum, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha permits collecting that chov from the akum in the case of a milva balpeh, because in that case the uh, the akum feels only tsar by having to pay back this chov that he thought maybe he wouldn't have to pay back because there was no proof, as opposed to mil bishtar, which the lova, in this case the akum, feels very happy about the fact that he removed from his shoulders that yoke of responsibility to pay back the chov that he eventually would have had to pay back because the Jew has a shtar. But what's Hilchasa ki Rabbi Yehuda? So in order to explain Hilchasa Rabbi Yehuda, the Gemara quotes a machlokes that is recorded in a Mishnah. It says here in the Gemara Desanya, but it really should say Desnan. And this is a Mishnah in Masechet Bava Kama. So let's just review quickly as we ended the shir yesterday with the case of a dyer, and the owner of the wool gave raw wool to the dyer to be dyed, but he wanted a certain color, and the dyer changed the color from black to red, red to black. And the Mishnah records Machlok Shin Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda about the responsibility of the dyer, who's called the tzaba. Hanosein tzemer letzaba letzvo ba'adam letzvo shachar shachar letzvo adam. Now we start our daf for today. And now we start with the Shita of Rabbi Meir. Now Rabbi Meir understands that the very moment that the dyer changes and deviates from his commission, and instead of dyeing it one color, he dyes it at that moment he becomes a gazlan. Because a gazlan is kona b'shinui. And this is considered a shinui. He changed the nature of the wool against the will of the owner of the wool. That constitutes gzela, and we have a principle with regard to gzela, and that is mishalim kishas hagzela, and that's called in Reb Meir's language here in this particular case nosein lo dmei tzmaro. So in other words, the tzemer, the raw material, is the value that has to be paid by the gazlan in this case, who's the dyer, the tzaba, who changed from black to red or vice versa. So that's clear that according to Rabbi Meir, the chiyuv here of the tzaba is that of a gazlan. But Rabbi Yehuda holds that a gazlan is only kona v'shinui under certain specific conditions that don't apply here in this case, and therefore the chiyuv of the dyer of the tzaba is not a chiyuv of a gazlan, in which we would apply Reb Meir's principle of kishas hagzela, but rather it's a chiyuv of hilchas mazik. Notice he's not a thief, but he damaged the property of the owner of the wool. So Rabbi Yehuda says that when you calculate the amount of money that the dyer has to pay, you have two variables, and you have to determine which of those variables in the particular case that you're dealing with is higher in value and which is lower. What are these two variables? So one variable is called shvach. Shvach means that, let's say, the wool in its natural state is worth, let's call it 100. Now it's been dyed, albeit a different color than the color that the Baal Bais was interested in, but nevertheless, it does increase the value of the natural wool, so that wool in nature is worth 100, but now that it's been painted and dyed, even though, again, it's not the same color that he wanted, but nevertheless, it's worth more on the market. Now, there's another variable here, and that's called yitzia. So we have shvach. Shvach means the increment in value on the market as a result of the dyeing. And then we have an element of a variable called shvach. Shvach means, I'm sorry, yitzia. What is yitzia? Yitzia is the amount of money it cost the dyer, the tzaba, in order to create this dyed wool, meaning he has to pay for the dye itself, and then the time and so forth, and the efforts. So we take these two variables, says Rabbi Yehuda, and we determine which is the higher and which is the lower variable, which is worth more. And he says the following: Im ashvach yesal yitzia nosin lo es hayitzia. Meaning, it's called Yado al Hel Yona. As far as the owner of the wool is concerned, he will always pay the lower of those two values. So therefore, if the increment in value on the market is greater than the expense, then the Bailim will only have to pay the Yitzia, which is the expense. But Im HaYitzia Yisera al Ashvach, if the amount of money that was invested here is greater than the increase in the value of the object on the market, then the Bailim will only have to pay Nosein Es Hashvach. He'll pay the lower fee, and that would be Shvach in this case. Comes along Rav Huna, and he says that in this Machlok Shin Chachamim Rabbi Shimon Karcha, we paskin. I'm sorry, and Rabbi Yehuda, we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. So Adrinu Rav Yosef the Ape, Rav Yosef made a gesture. He turned his face in such a way that he indicated that what Rav Huna was saying was totally unnecessary. So Gemara says the following: Bishleim halacha Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha itzrich. It couldn't be that Rav Yosef was upset and disappointed with Rav Huna's passing like Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, because we need that psak like Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. If not for Rav Huna, we would have said that Yochid Ram Halacha Karab, we passing like the Rabbim against the Yochid. And therefore, Kamash Malon, I need Rav Huna to tell me that in this particular case, halacha ki yochid, and we're going to pass like Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha against the majority. Ela halacha Rabbi Yehuda lamali pshita. But, says Rav Yosef, I didn't need you, Rav Huna, to establish and to reveal the great secret that we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda against the Chachamim. That was obvious. Why? Because we have a rule of machlokas v'yachas stam hilchsa kistam, that if you look at the Seder HaMishnayos and you have Mishnah X that comes first in the sequence and it records a controversy, and then you have a later Mishnah, Mishnah Y, that is stam, and it just tells you the halacha without mentioning any dissenting opinion, then that's a sign from Rabbi Yehuda Nasi that when he organized the sequence of the Mishnah, he was telling us that we paskin like that man diyamar, whose opinion is incorporated into the stam without any name, as an anonymous opinion. So therefore, the Gemara is going to now show us that Rav Yosef was disappointed with Rav Huna because the case of a dyer who dyed the color of the wool a different color than the one that he was commissioned to dye, then we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. I know that. Why do I know that? Because of the principle called machlokas v'yachar stam. Machlokas bava kama, the original machlokas shin chachamim, and Rabbi Yehuda is recorded in Masechet bava kama, which comes before Bab Metzia. But ustam, but later on a later Mishnah in Bab Metzia, then we have a Mishnah that paskins like Rabbi Yehuda without mentioning any names. It's an anonymous Mishnah. Stam. The Snan, what do we find in the Mishnah in Bab Metzia, the later Mishnah? Kol Mishana Yado al Tachtona, V'chol Achozer Bo Yado al Tachtona. So, in other words, anyone who is Mishana, which means that instead of complying with the will of the Balabayas who hired him, he deviates and violates the will of the Balabayas, then Yado al Tachtona, as we said before, depending upon these two variables, Shvach and Yitzia, which is the lower Yitzia, that's how much the lower figure, that's what he's going to pay. For Rav Huna, doesn't Rav Huna realize that this is an explicit case of machlokas v'yachar stam? Why did he feel he discovered America by having to tell me that we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda? And the Gemara answers, Mishum di ein seder lemishnah, that Rabbi Yehuda's opinion was that the way that you find the Mishnah is actually organized by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi does not necessarily indicate which came first. So it could be that a later Mishnah really took place earlier, and then later on, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, when he found out about the controversy, the debate on that issue, then he wrote that Mishnah. So again, the Seder HaMishnah doesn't tell you anything. And therefore, Ikal Meimar, Stam, Tana Bereisha, V'akach Machlokes. That actually what went on in the sequence, in the chronological debates within the Beis Medrash when they were learning the sugyas, it might have been just the opposite. That originally they had the Stam, in other words, they only mentioned one anonymous opinion without attributing it to any particular Tana, and then later on they re-examined that issue and they came up with a machlokas of two opinions. So we cannot know for sure that the Stam came after the machlokas. Maybe it was machlokas first and Stam later. Rav Yosef responds, wait a minute, Ihachi, kol machlok zakar Stam lema instead of a Mishnah? Are you meaning to tell me, Rav Huna, that the entire principle of machlokas v'yachar Stam has to be junked and it will never apply because ain't said a Mishnah? No, says the Gemara. That's not what Rav Huna meant to say. Rav Huna, kilo amrin ain't said of a Mishnah, that's b'chada Masechta. Within one Masechta, you cannot prove from the fact that it appears in a certain sequence that reflects the chronological order of the discussions within the Beis Medrash when they were learning the sugya. But betray Masechta Amrina, if you have two different Masechtas, then for sure you know that the reason why Rabbi Yehuda Nasi organized the machlokas in the first of these two Masechtas, and then a Stam Mishnah in the second two Masechtas, is in order to paskin like that opinion in the original controversy that is now embodied in the letter Mishnah, which is a Stam Mishnah. So that means the following, that in the case of one Masechta, and you have two Mishnayos within one Masechta, then Rav Huna says, Ein Seder La Mishnah. And that's called Lo Amrinon Ein Seder La Mishnah. No. Again, let me clarify. From one Masechta to another Masechta, then Rav Huna applies the principle of Ein Seder La Mishnah. The fact that in the second Masechta, which is later in the Seder Hashas, the Mishnah is recorded as a Stam Mishnah, that doesn't prove a thing, because Rav Huna holds Ein Seder La Mishnah. When do we apply the principle of stam v'achach machlokas? That's only within the same Masechta. But here that we have a case of two different Masechtas, one is Bava Kama, where we record the machlokas and the stam mishnahs in Bava Metzia, then we apply the principle according to Rav Huna of Ein Seder L'Mishnah, affecting more Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef should also understand that in two different Masechtas, we don't apply the principle of stam v'achach machlokas, but rather we apply the principle of Ein Seder L'Mishnah. And the Gemara answers Kula Nezikin Chada Masechta, that Bava Metzia is not a new Masechta, but rather Bava Metzia is the extension of and the continuation of Bava Kama, and so too Bava Basra. All the Bavas form one Masechta. And therefore, says Rav Huna, when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi organized the sequence within any of those three Masechtas, which are called Nezikin, and it's all one Masechta, then we apply the principle of Stam V'Achach Machlokes, because Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was very deliberate about the Seder. So the Gemara asks, okay, you're telling me now that Kula Nezikin Chada Masechta he? So that would mean that Rav Huna disagreed. He held that every Masechta within Nezikin, whether it's Bava Metzia, Bava Kama, each one is a separate Masechta. And therefore, when you see a Stam Mishnah in a different Masechta, namely Bava Metzia, we apply the principle of Ein Seder L'Mishnah. Ibai Seimer, the Gemara offers another possible reason why Rav Yosef rejected Rav Huna, is Mishum de Ketani Legabi Hilchas Apsikta, because what Rabbi Yehuda Nasi did deliberately is he has a Mishnah which is called Hilchas Apsikta. In other words, he sort of organizes klolim, principles, general principles in halacha, doesn't mention any names. And when he does so, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's intention was to convey the message that this is how we paskin. And where do we find this phenomenon, this manifestation of Hilchas Apsikta? We find it dafka in Bava Metzia. The Mishnah Bava Metzia, we're on Daf Ayin Hey, and there the Mishnah says, so we see what we call a Hilchas Apsikta. Hilchas Apsikta means that these are the halachic rules that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi formulated la'alocha l'maisa as the final word. And there it says, which reflects the shita of Rabbi Yehuda against the Chachamim. And that's why Rabbi Yosef felt that there was no need for Rav Huna, no justification for him to tell me that we passing like Rabbi Yehuda. Tana Rabbana. Lo Yomar Adam Lechaver. We're talking about the Iser of Vidabru Davar, and Mimotza Chafatzecha, which is a pasuk in Yeshaya in Kabbalah that we learn that you're not allowed to do business on Shabbos. You're not allowed to talk about business on Shabbos. So, for example, you want to hire a worker, you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. You can't tell him, oh, I want you to do this work for me after Shabbos. So therefore, the Chachamim say that if you use the term hanira, we'll see what that word hanira means, shetamo de'imi la'erev. Now, the word hanira comes from a pasuk in Brachis, which says havo navo, literally, shall we see, shall we come, and it means shetamod imi la'erev, I hope we'll able to see that you will work for me after Shabbos. And the Chacham say that even though you didn't say explicitly that you're hiring him, but it was understood that that's what you meant, you're not allowed to say that on Shabbos. Rabbi Yeshua ben Karchomer, he is lenient, and he holds Omer Adam l'chaver anira shetamod imi la'erev. You can say those words, even though it clearly is understood and conveys the message you want to hire him, because it's not called Imotziv Charatzecha, you didn't say it explicitly. Omer Rab Baruch Hanum Rab Yochanan Hilchas Rabbi Yeshua ben Karchomer. We pass like Rabbi Yeshua ben Karchomer. Tana Rabbanan. Another machlokes between the Chacham and Rabbi Yeshua ben Karchomer. Hanisha lechacham v'time lo yisha lechacham v'yataya lechacham v'yasar lo yisha lechacham v'yate. You can't go from one chacham and get a psak on a ruling by asking him chacham A question and getting the answer, and then go on and ask chacham B the same question to hopefully get a different answer. So if the first Chacham said it was Tameh, and you had a case of a Safek Tumah, now you're not allowed to go on to another Chacham and find that the other Chacham hopefully will paskin Tar, or the other way around. If, let's say, the first Chacham was asked the question of Isa Heter, and you got an answer from the first Chacham that it's also, you're not allowed to go on to another Chacham in order to try to extract from him a Heter leniency. However, Hayu Shneim, let's say, for example, you appeared in front of two rabbis. There were two rabbis sitting there simultaneously, and you came with your question. And you got two different answers for the two different rabbis simultaneously. Echad mitame, echad mitayr. Echad oser, v'echad matir. So what's the guidelines here? What's the rules? Here we have machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Shimon ben Karcha. What do you do in this case? According to the Chachamim, im haya echad mehem gadol mechaver b'chacham minyan halach acharav, v'im lav halach achar machmir. So it works like this. As a general rule, if you get two answers from these two rabbis, different answers, one is machmir, one is mekir, one says it's also, one says it's mutter, then you have to accept the opinion of the machmir. However, the exception to the rule is, let's say the mekir is greater than the machmir. He's greater in two ways. Number one, he's greater in chachma, meaning he knows more, he has more experience, he has a greater body of knowledge, treasure of knowledge, ubeminyan. Now, what does the word b'minyan mean? Here we have a machlokes in the Rishonim what the word b'minyan is. According to the Ritva, minyan means a number of years that he studied under the guidance of a greater Torah scholar. Now, he did shimush for a greater number of years, and that's called b'minyan. However, according to the Rambam, the word b'minyan means we count how many disciples he has, how many talmidim does he have. So the chacham that has more talmidim is the one upon whom you could rely lekula, even though the other chacham who has less talmidim is machmir. But otherwise, if they're equal and there's no gadol b'menu b'chacham b'minyan, then the rule of thumb is halach achar machmir. That's the Tanakam. And now we get to Rabbi Shimon Karcha. Rabbi Shimon Karcha says depends. What is the nature? How do you classify the question that you're asking? If it's Bishel Torah, if you're asking a question about a din doraisa, whether it's Tamei Tar, whether it's also a mutter, then I agree with the Chachamim that we have to follow the opinion of the more stringent one. But if it's Bishel Sofrim, if the whole issue revolves around an Isa Drabanan, like for example, as we'll soon see on the next Amud, Truma of Yerakos, which is vegetables, is only Drabanan, then halach achar ha-mekil, then you rely on the mekil. Rav Yosef Hilchas Rav Yishuv ben Kar. Ton Rabbanan. Okay, now we have another machlokas between the Tanoim, and what's it about? Kulam shechazru bahem. Okay, so now we have Rabbi Meir. What does Rabbi Meir hold? So we can translate the words of Rabbi Meir literally, and then we'll offer a different shot because it's very difficult. According to the literal translation of Rabbi Meir, Kulam shechazru b'hem, we're talking about someone who is disqualified for testimony or for taking an oath because he has a very bad track record. And now chazru b'hem, now he does tshuva. And yet, Rabbi Meir says, Ein mekabel noson olamis. He has forfeited his status as a witness, as a valid aid or a valid nishba. He can't take a shvuah forever and ever. And no matter what tshuva he does, then Rabbi Meir says we cannot accept him. He's pasul yom me'at. He's completely excluded forever and ever. However, as I told you before, that might be the literal translation of Rabbi Meir. But the Rishonim are troubled with that. Why is it that we can't accept a person who does tshuva? So therefore, we have another interpretation, and when it says v'kulon, Rabbi Meir says v'kulon shechazru b'hem, the word v'kulon means all those who at one point, we'll call it T1, were disqualified, and then at point T2 they did tshuva, and we reinstated them to validate and rely on their testimony. And then chazru bahem. Chazru bahem means no, not that they did tshuva, but rather they reverted back to their original ways, their evil ways. In such a case, ein mekablin osan olamis. They have forever forfeited the right to testify. We never rely on them, because now we believe that we were fooled in a certain sense when we accepted his repentance and then we qualified him and brought him back to being an aid. But now we see that it wasn't a real tshuva. And this man is, I hate to say it, but forever embedded in this Avera mode, and will never accept him at all. Who disagrees? Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, chazru bahem matmonios, ein mekablin oson, b'farhesia mekablin oson. And once again, we have two interpretations. One interpretation is that Rabbi Yeshua's differentiation between what he did in public and what he did in private refers to the Avera itself. And therefore, if the Avera was done privately, then it's much easier for us to accept and requalify him and kasher him up, because there's no element of public chil Hashem. But if he did the Avera publicly, that's going to be a very big problem in terms of reinstating him to Eidos. His tshuva is going to have to be a different. The other interpretation of Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is not where did he commit the Avera, but where did he go through the process of tshuva, right? There were certain external manifestations of tshuva where you show that you did tshuva. And the question is, do you demonstrate that publicly or privately? If you demonstrate it publicly and you're willing to, so to speak, experience self-humiliation, that is a sincere tshuva, and then we can reestablish and reinstate you as a kosher aid. However, the Gemara now quotes a different version, alternative version of Rabbi Yehuda. Ika diamri, others say, asu divreim b'matmonios mekablin osan. So now the Gemara says explicitly that according to the Ika diamri, the discussion of Rabbi Yehuda and the differentiation between public and private revolves around the Ma'aseh Avera. And here we're going to say the following, that asu divreim b'matmonios, if let's say the Avera took place in private, then mekablin osan, and we can accept them and reinstate them, because their Avera was on a lower level. But if their Avera was b'farhesia, then Rabbi Yehuda agrees to the Rabbi Meir Shita ein mekablin osan.